So, tonight, as I mentioned, our message is on the covenants. I'm not going to cover all the covenants or all the different types of covenants, but I do want to cover a handful of the key covenants tonight. But before we do that, I like to start my sermons with a story. So, how many know that our life is like a car, right? So our life is like a car. And the question I have is Jesus inside the car or is he outside the car? So how many say that he's in our car? Awesome. How many have him outside? If you have him outside, I encourage you, bring him inside the car. All right, so how many of those who have him in the car have him in the trunk? They bring him to church on Sunday and Wednesday, take him out for happy hour, and then put him back in the trunk. Get back in there, right? Okay, I saw one hand. Thanks for being honest. I appreciate that. So we don't really want him in the trunk, right? We want him inside the car. Who has him in the back seat? He's riding along with us. He's our passenger. Maybe we're his Uber driver. No. Okay, how many have him in the front passenger seat? He's a companion. He's our companion. He's riding along. I saw 1, 2, okay, 3. That's a good, thank you for being honest about that. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. I know what he's going to say next. Jesus should be in the driver's seat, right? Well, yep, that's what I was going to say. Jesus should be in your driver's seat. But how many are backseat drivers? How many of us are backseat drivers? We're letting Jesus drive, and instead of letting him take us wherever he wants to go, he gets there, he gets to the road, he gets to a stop sign, and he takes a left. And he goes down Forgiveness Lane. How many of you go, ooh, I didn't really want to go there yet. I'm not ready to give that one up yet. Or he takes a right down Repentance Lane, like, oh, I'm really not ready to give that part up. Let's go somewhere else. So we have to be willing to let him drive, and we have to trust him enough to let him take us where he wants us to go, not where we want to go. And that'll be important as we talk about the covenants, as we move a little further forward. So why are we talking about covenants? They're just agreements, right? Agreements between us and God. That's right, they are. But because they're with God, they're solemn, sacred agreements. And they have divine promises. God makes us promises. But he expects obedience and faith. So we'll talk about that in each of the covenants. The agreements define his relationship with us, and they demonstrate his plan and his love for us. And this plan ultimately culminated in the new covenant, which is the covenant that Jesus secured by his blood, that whoever believes in him would be saved and would have everlasting life. So, in that sense, all the other covenants, God essentially said, I tried making covenants with man, and they just messed it up. They failed. So, how do I do this so that it can't be broken? Because all of the other covenants were broken. So he finally said, well, if I'm going to have a covenant that can't be broken, I'm going to have to go down to earth as a man, live a perfect life, and make a covenant with myself. That one can't be broken, and I won't allow it to be broken. Because man is too imperfect and too untrustworthy to keep our side of the bargain. He keeps his side, we don't keep ours. So we've talked a little bit about covenants. I want to cover some key aspects of covenants. One, they are agreements. They're agreements between us and God. God acts as one of the partners in those covenants. And with that, it comes promises and responsibilities. So God makes promises to us, and then he expects us to fulfill our side. He wants us to have faith, and he wants us to obey. So they contain those expectations. They also contain his divine love, a benefit to humankind, and also a purpose. And a lot of the purpose is focused around his expectation and of us to spread the culture of heaven across the earth. If you think about the first covenant that he made with Adam, Adam was supposed to, hang on, I'm going to say this wrong because I always say, live long and prosper, but that's not it. It's be fruitful and multiply. So they were supposed to be fruitful and multiply and go about the world, and that was really to spread the culture of heaven across the world. So that was the original covenant. So our purpose is eventually to spread the culture of heaven across the world. The next aspect of the agreements with God is that they are generally sealed by blood. So in the old days, in the biblical days, back when he made the covenant with Abraham, for example, they made a covenant in blood. And they didn't actually call it making a covenant, they called it cutting a covenant. And in that covenant, they would split multiple animals, put one on one side, one on the other, and they would make an aisle. And that each party would walk down that aisle making a vow. And then the expectation was if you broke that vow, you would end up like the animals on either side. So it was sealed with blood. So how many does that remind you of any other covenants that we make? Probably marriage, right? Our wedding covenants. We walk down an aisle, we make our vows. We're expected to be together forever, not break our covenant. So if we had the dead animals on each side and our vow was, may we be like these animals if we break our covenant, how many of us would commit adultery or have that lust in our lives? Probably not very many. So in this series, I'm going to cover 5 key covenants. I'm not going to cover them all, like I said. I'm going to cover 5 key aspects. I'm going to cover the Noahic covenant, the covenant with Noah. I'm going to cover the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the New Covenant. Tonight, I'm just going to focus on Noah and Abraham. I do want to just spend a minute to talk about the purpose of each of those covenants. In the Noahic covenant, it was really the purpose was to set the stage, almost like a reset. Adam and Eve fell in the garden, and they were kicked out of the garden. God said that the earth was evil, and he was going to destroy the earth. This was really a reset of the earth. And he expected Noah and his family to go out and spread the culture of heaven around the earth, just like his expectation was with Adam and Eve, but they failed. In Abraham's covenant, the purpose was really to secure a multitude of people. If you remember, his offspring would outnumber the stars in the sky or the sands in the ocean. And in that multitude of people would then spread the culture of heaven across the earth and into the promised land. In the Mosaic covenant, Moses set the Israelites free from Egypt, but the purpose was to really set the standard, the law, set the standard and make a conditional relationship. This was a temporary covenant, but it was to set the relationship that required obedience to receive the blessings. The Davidic covenant really set the stage for the lineage of David to rule forever. That was the purpose of that covenant. And then finally, the new covenant, it was to offer salvation to all of those who believed in Jesus. It was established by his blood. And it had God's law written in our hearts. That was part of the covenant, is we wouldn't have to wonder, was it lawful or not? It would be written in our hearts. So each of these covenants played a part in establishing heaven's kingdom on earth. So on earth as it is in heaven. That's part of our mission, our vision. The first two covenants I'm going to cover, I mentioned, were the covenant with Noah and the covenant with Abraham. The covenant with Noah, most people think about post-flood, right? He's not going to come back and destroy the earth with water again. He gave us the rainbow as a sign. I really want to focus on the covenant that he made before the flood, because that set the stage. So who has their Bibles with them? I'll read from Genesis chapter 6. We're going to start in verse 4, and then we're going to read through this real quickly. We'll go verse 4 through 8, verses 12 through 14, and then verses 17 and 18. So starting in verse 4, and this is in chapter 6, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. So the fallen angels had children, offspring, with man, women of earth, and the Nephilim were born. These were mighty men of old and the men of renown. And they were also giants. And the Lord saw the wickedness that of man that was great in the earth, and every intention of the thoughts in his heart was evil continually, only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he made man on earth. And it grieved him in his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created, from the face of the earth, of the land, and all men and animals and creeping things and birds of heaven, for I'm sorry that I've made them. He was regretting having made us. But he found Noah righteous, so he decided to save Noah. So Noah, I said, was a righteous man, and God saw the earth was corrupt, and all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. So a lot of people think that means that the bloodline of man was corrupted by the blood of the fallen angels. The majority of the earth was evil because the fallen angels had corrupted the bloodline of humans. And God said to Noah, so this is where the covenant comes in, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. So he gave specific instructions on how to build the ark. And then he said in verse 17, for behold, I will bring a flood upon the waters of the earth, a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh that is in the breath of the life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die, but I will make a covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, and you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. So he was making a covenant with Noah to save humanity. So his promise, like I mentioned, came before the flood. This wasn't the after the flood covenant. There was also that one. And God had decided to destroy the earth because it had become evil. We talked about why it had become evil. But God found Noah to be righteous, and he spoke to Noah. And so Noah had an encounter with God. And we'll talk about encounters a little bit later. He had an encounter with God, and instead of destroying all flesh, he made a covenant with Noah to save him, his sons, and his sons' wives, and his wife. Obviously, after the flood, we talked about, he said he would never destroy the earth again. He gave us a symbol of that covenant, which was the rainbow, still in existence today. But to achieve that covenant, to keep his side of the bargain, Noah had to be faithful and obedient to God's word to make that happen. So if you think about this, Noah was about 500 years old when he heard the word from God to build the ark. He was 600 years old when he went on the ark, he and his family. So he built that ark for 100 years. 100 years he had to be obedient and faithful to build that ark. He did that in the face of ridicule, people gossiping about him, calling him crazy. They weren't being very helpful. They were not very helpful. They were very ridiculing to him. They picked on him. They would call him bullies. They were bullies to him. And you got to remember, there was no evidence of any rain for that 100-year time period. There was no evidence of rain. So that took obedience to be able to go through and build the ark for 100 years in the face of all that ridicule and no evidence of rain coming. It took a lot of obedience. And if you look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7, it says, "By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, he constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this, he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith." So he became an heir to the Lord by his faith. Remember, when he built the ark, there wasn't a Home Depot. He couldn't go down and just pick up supplies at the lumber yard and buy tools. I remember when I built my daughter's playhouse when we lived in Baton Rouge. I bought all the tools that you would ever need to build a playhouse. But he had to make his own tools. He had to build them from scratch, from the land. So he didn't have all of that. He also didn't have any experience with boats or floods or waters. He'd never built a boat before. So he had to be obedient and faithful to build the ark just as God had instructed him to. He had to be faithful to that plan. He also had to collect male and female of every animal on the planet. But people don't think about this part. He had to also be prepared to feed those animals for a year because they were on the ark for a year. He had to trust that God would close the door behind him when it did start to rain, because the door was too heavy for them to move. He had to trust that God's design was going to work, that it was going to float, that it was going to keep them safe, it wasn't going to leak. And he had to trust that the flood would actually end. Once the floodwaters came, he had to be faithful that the floodwaters would end. And that God would open the door for him when he got off, because remember, it was too heavy for them to move. So it all took a lot of faith on Noah's part. Not just for him and his family, but it was for all humanity. Just think of what would have happened if Noah hadn't been faithful if he would have listened to the naysayers who said, it's not going to rain, if he would have listened to the enemy and said, they think you're crazy, you better stop doing that. There's no rain. It's not going to rain. It's never going to rain. It's never rained before. So it wasn't just for him, it was for all of humanity. So he had to be faithful. And we talked a little bit about why God made that covenant. It was really for a couple of reasons. He loved us. He loved man. He created man in his own image. So he wanted to save us. And he did through Noah and his family. And part of that was to help us to spread the culture of heaven across the earth. That was part of our purpose. If you think about when Adam and Eve were on the earth and they fell, God had told them to be fruitful and multiply and to subdue the earth and to have dominion over it. And that didn't mean just go out and make babies and use up the resources of the earth. That meant be fruitful and multiply and to govern the earth in the same manner that God would govern heaven. To take his heart and his character and govern everything on the earth like he would govern, like he does govern heaven. So our job was then to take, and Noah's job was then to take that principle, God's heart, God's character, and spread it across the globe. And that covenant set the stage for restitution, and it was really a reset of that original plan. Because Adam and Eve failed. His next option, his next choice was Noah, and so he wanted Noah to succeed. Ultimately, that covenant was broken too. Noah became a drunk. His son Shem saw his nakedness. A lot of people believe that means that Shem slept with Noah's wife, or his mom, slept with his mom. If you remember, this is the same period shortly after that the Tower of Babel was built. So God had to confuse the languages and spread people across the globe. So we broke that covenant too. The next covenant I want to talk about is the covenant with Abraham. And the covenant with Abraham, you think of Abraham as the father of faith, right? He was the father of faith. That's what he's known for. But if you look at the story of Abraham, if you study it closely, it was really an up and down story. He had great faith, and then he had no faith. Then he had great faith, and then he had no faith. Then he had great faith, and then no faith. It was this cycle. And for us, it just shows us, even Abraham, who's the father of faith, had struggles with faith. So why wouldn't we? But it doesn't mean that we can't get back on the horse, get back at that level where we were, have great faith, and trust God. And if you do that cycle long enough, hopefully the lows will not be as low and the depths will not be as long in duration. The longer duration will be the highs. So that's what we want. So if we go to Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Where am I at? Says, now the Lord said to Abram, remember he hadn't renamed him yet. He's still Abram at this point. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and those who dishonor you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So God made a promise to Abram, that he would make him a great nation, and he would take him out of that land and show him a place that he was supposed to go. And initially, Abram was very faithful. He left his family. He left his family behind, except for Lot. Still processing that part, but he took Lot with him, and he took Sarai, which he was supposed to do. But he believed that promise, even though he was 75 years old already. So he was an old man. Sarai was old as well, and her womb was already dead. So he was going to make a great nation from what? But Abraham trusted him. So he was obedient when God called him. And he left his home and his family behind. And he journeyed to that unknown land. And when he got to the land of the Canaanites, God told him that he and his offspring would be given that land. Even though they'd have to go through some suffering, he would be given that land. And so Abraham showed faith in God by leaving his homeland and his parents and journeying to a new place. But that faith wasn't always present. If you go to the next chapter, Genesis 12, verses 11 through 13, you'll see where Abram's faith started to fall off. It says when he was, well, I'm going to read it out of here. Okay, when he was about to enter Egypt, he and Sarai, his wife, he said to Sarai, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and the Egyptians will see you and they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you're my sister, so that it will go well with me, of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. So God had told Abram already that he would curse those who dishonored him. So why did he think that the Egyptians would kill him if those who dishonored him would be cursed? But instead, so he still told him that Sarai was his sister and not his wife. So he didn't trust God to fulfill his side of the bargain. Even though he had left his home, even though he had left his family behind, except for Lot, he left his family behind, he still didn't trust God completely. So in some ways he was obedient, but he didn't trust, he didn't have faith. So, and this was after he had already had an encounter with God, right? So he had already had his encounter with God, at least one. And God made promises and told him what he needed to do. But how many know that it's not just about the encounter? It has to be followed with faith and trust and a relationship with God. And it's not that different from us. A lot of us chase the encounter. We go to tent revivals, we go to seminars, we go to this healing minister or that healing minister because we're chasing the experience. We're not chasing the relationship with God. And that's where our salvation is. It requires that strong relationship and our faith to mature. We can't just go along with immature faith. We can't go along as babies, baby Christians, or even little children Christians. We have to become the fathers and young adults that God intended us to be. So, it's not just about the encounter, it's about the faith and the obedience to God. So after Sodom and Gomorrah, God came to Abram in a vision and reaffirmed his covenant. If you look at Genesis chapter 15, verses 3 through 5, it says, "And Abram said to God, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will become my heir, not my son. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him." So God spoke to him and said, "This man shall not be your heir, for your very own son will be your heir." And he brought him outside and he said, "Look towards the heavens, number them if you can." And then he said to them, "So shall be your offspring. So shall your offspring be." So your offspring will be like the number of the stars in the sky. And if you remember, they didn't have all the light pollution that we have, so you could see all the stars. So God, once again, he reaffirmed his covenant with Abram. And Abram believed him, and it was counted to him as faith, as righteousness. But he still failed again. This is at least his second encounter with God and his second promise that was given to him. But in chapter 16, verse 2 and 4, says that Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, and it may be that I shall obtain children from her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai, and he went into Hagar, and she conceived. So, once again, God had promised him a son, and he still didn't trust him. And because of that lack of trust, he had a son called Ishmael. How many have heard of the religion of Islam, the Muslims? So that's supposedly where the Islamic religion came from, is from Ishmael. So look at all the problems that's caused because of Abraham's lack of trust. It caused us to deal with the condemnation and the murder of Christians across the world at the hands of the Islamic people, or Islamic leaders. But in the next chapter, God takes another step. He changes Abram's name to Abraham. It means father of many, father of nations. And he also changed Sarah's name. And he reaffirmed his covenant. Once again, now remember, this is the third encounter. So most people would say 3 strikes, you're out, right? So this is your third strike. But God doesn't do that. God continued to uphold his end of the bargain. And in Genesis 17:9, it says that God said to Abram, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations." And he promised a son would be born from Sarah, and that son would be named Isaac. And again, this was his third encounter. God made that promise to Abraham. And in spite of all this, and God continuing to bless him, because remember, he took him out of Egypt. Abraham became a really wealthy man during this time frame. Abraham still found it hard to believe. So when God told him that he would have a son from Sarah, he laughed. He fell on his face and laughed. And when Sarah heard it, she laughed. They didn't believe him. They didn't trust that God would fulfill his promise. They didn't see any way around that. So in addition, in Genesis 20, verses 1 and 2, says that from there, Abraham journeyed into the territory of the Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. So this is the second time that he claimed that Sarah was his sister and not his wife, so that he would be protected. And Abimelech, the king of Gerar, took Sarah. So once again, Abraham didn't trust God to protect him, even though he had given him multiple promises that he would protect him, and that he would be a father of a great nation through Isaac. He later tried to make an excuse and just said that, there was no fear of God in that place, so that's why he told him that, but that was an excuse. We all want to know what people say about excuses. So, again, you can have encounters with God. Remember, this was at least his third encounter, his third strike. And he still didn't believe. And you have to have faith and trust and be able to act on that faith. And then finally, God tested him again. And in that last test, he finally fully trusted and obeyed God. In Genesis 22, verses 1 and 2, said, God tested and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, he laid it on Isaac, his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And God so when they came to the place that God told him, Abraham built the altar. He laid the wood there. He bound Isaac, his son. He had him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord stopped him. And he gave him the ram in the bush and said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God and that you have not withheld your son. Remember, his son was his promise. He'd had multiple encounters with God. Isaac was Abraham's promise to become a great nation. So he was giving up his promise from God to trust God to fulfill his side of the bargain. So when he went up, he fully expected, if he sacrificed Isaac, that God would resurrect him, that he would come back with his son, because that was his promise. So he trusted God completely, and he completely surrendered to him. So we talked about this a little bit earlier. Why did God make this covenant with Abraham? It was to create a nation or a multitude from Abraham that was secured in this covenant, and Abraham would come from Abraham would come more offspring than the stars in the sky. And the multitude that was intended to spread the culture of heaven across the earth and also into the promised land. And Hebrews 11 and 8 and 12 say that by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. And therefore from one man And him, as good as dead, remember he was 75 years old when he got the promise. He was 100 years old when Isaac was born. Were born descendants, as many as the stars of heaven, and many as innumerable as the grains of sand by the seashore. So in that covenant, he gained this multitude of people that he could send out to spread the culture of heaven across the globe. So Abraham, we talked about, is considered the father of faith. He did have great faith. But that faith was mixed with unbelief and a lack of trust. So you can see that these covenants with God require both faith and obedience. You can't have just one. Abraham was obedient. He left his home. But he didn't trust. It took that final step of trust and that obedience together before he would receive his full blessing. So what would have happened if Noah or Abraham hadn't fulfilled their promise? I don't think any of us would be in this room today, right? We wouldn't be here. And do you realize that we're all in a covenant with God today? And that covenant is through the blood of Jesus Christ. And that covenant also carries a great promise of salvation for those who believe. But it requires both faith and obedience. This new covenant gives us great promises, but it comes with responsibilities and requirements. We have requirements of faith and obedience to follow him and to spread the culture of heaven to all the nations. If you think about when Jesus, before he ascended, he told the disciples, all authority has been given to me on heaven and earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. Baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teach them all the things that I have told you. So we're supposed to make disciples. Part of our job is to make disciples. That's how we spread the culture, is we spread the culture of heaven and the way, the lifestyle of heaven across the globe. That's our job. And it doesn't just say make disciples. It says make disciples and teach them all the things that I have taught you or told you. So we're not supposed to make disciples of me or you. We're supposed to make disciples of Jesus Christ. And that's a key important difference. So what happens if we don't fulfill our promise? What if we don't have faith? Or what if we aren't obedient? Well, our children and their children and their children and our friends and our loved ones, they won't know Christ. And that's just not acceptable. It's our responsibility to make sure that that doesn't happen.